All right, so today we are finishing up this series that we've been in the last 4 weeks. So if you haven't been here, I'm going to get you caught up because where we've been matters tremendously for today. So this series is all about discipleship. It's all about what it looks like to walk out faith, following Jesus day in and day out. And so what we've done in the 3 parts leading into this week is we've looked at how a disciple is someone who is called by Jesus, a disciple is someone who walks closely behind Jesus, and a disciple is someone who listens, learns, and obeys Jesus kind of with the people around them in community. That is what a disciple is to this point. But there's kind of a problem. And that problem is that right now where we are is where, quite honestly, a lot of people stop. They're called by Jesus. They decide to follow Jesus. They walk with Jesus the best they know how. They listen to Jesus. They learn from Jesus. They try to obey Jesus, and they stop. This is especially prevalent in the American church, and I don't want to stereotype that too awful much, but the reality is in the American church, we have so indoctrinated people with this idea of a personal relationship with Jesus, which it is, but that's become the center of everything to the point that then it's like, well, as long as I'm growing in Jesus, as long as I'm learning and I'm developing in my relationship with Him personally, that's the point. And that's good enough. That's not good enough, that's good. But it misses the entire point of discipleship. The whole point. In other words, if we stop at follow Jesus, walk with Him, listen, learn, and obey, if we stop there, then we actually never end up doing the main thing that Jesus calls disciples to begin with to do. And so this week is critical. It is absolutely crucial. And to illustrate why, I want to kind of tease out what might sound like a little bit of a ridiculous scenario. But let's just say for a moment that the first disciples, Matthew, Mark, James, John, Peter, all the first disciples, all of them. Let's just say for a moment that they stopped at listen, learn, and obey. That was the end of their discipleship road. If that were the case, the name Jesus of Nazareth would have been lost to history within a century or two max. We wouldn't know who He was. Now, I say it's a little bit ridiculous because He is the Son of God and God has the power to do whatever He wants. So that is not the way that it would have gone, okay? But if those disciples had stopped at listen, learn, and obey, the name of Jesus does not get carried forward. We aren't here today celebrating Him, singing songs about Him, talking about Him. If it wasn't for the disciples and for this final piece of the puzzle that makes discipleship what it actually is intended to be, then we wouldn't be here. So, if we get close to Jesus and if we obey everything He says, but we neglect this last piece, then we've missed it. So as we finish up the series, let's look at the final bit of discipleship that Jesus did with the disciples. We're going to start today in Matthew chapter 28. This is what it says. If you've been in church throughout your life at all, you've heard this at some point. I've preached from it many times here over the years. Matthew chapter 28. Then the 11 disciples, 11 because Judas is gone at this point, the 11 disciples went to Galilee to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw Him, they worshiped Him, but some doubted. Then Jesus came to them and He said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. So therefore, go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I'm with you always to the very end of the age. It's the Great Commission. It's one of the most famous passages in the Bible. The final instructions Jesus gives His disciples before He ascends into heaven. So again, from a quick timeline perspective, this is post-death, post-resurrection. This is the final thing that Jesus tells the disciples, the very last thing. Now again, if you've been in church, you've heard this preached from many times. If you've been here, you've heard this preached from many times. And often the approach that somebody will take when they're preaching from it is they will emphasize the fact that Jesus that Jesus sends the disciples. But what I want you to notice today is not just that Jesus' final instructions were to send the disciples. What I want you to notice is that that instruction mirrors Jesus' first instruction to the disciples. And so we're going to rewind. And we're going to jump back to Mark chapter 1. This is a passage that I read in the first week of this series. We looked at it a little bit then through a slightly different lens. But again, today what I want you to notice is that what Jesus says is the same. Mark chapter 1, this is Jesus initially calling Simon and Andrew. So as Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, starting in verse 16. As Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and they followed him. It's the same thing. Go make disciples of all the nations. Come follow me and I'm going to make you fishers of people. I'm going to send you out. Look, at the end of the day, the reality here is simple. When Jesus called Simon and Andrew that day, I'm reading between the lines a little bit, but there is no way on earth that they truly understood what Jesus meant. They probably had an intuitive sense of part of what Jesus meant. They certainly understood that Jesus meant that they were going to impact people. I can promise you that there is no way that they in that moment thought, oh yeah, Jesus probably means that after about 3 years, he's going to leave. And he's going to put us in charge of reaching the whole world. They didn't. That's not what they thought. But it is exactly what Jesus meant in that moment. When Jesus called the first disciples, he called them with the intention to send them out. In other words, the goal was never that Simon and Andrew would say, yes, Jesus will follow you. And then they would walk behind him for 3 years and they would listen and learn and obey him and stop. It was always that listen, learn, and obey would result in them going, in them taking the message of Jesus, what they had seen, what they had heard, what they had witnessed, the resurrected Christ, and that they would preach his name to the nations. In other words, Jesus calls disciples to send disciples. That's the point. There is no part of discipleship in which Jesus calls disciples to just teach disciples. And that's what we tend to make it about. That's what we tend to focus on in the church. And to be honest, many of you know I've been in church essentially my whole life. I've never really walked away from it. I've always had a love for the local church. I've always had a love for the Lord. I've always done my best to follow him. And for a significant amount of my life, my focus has been on just like learning to obey Jesus better, which is an aspect of discipleship. But it is not the point of discipleship. The point of discipleship is to go. It was present in Jesus' initial call, and it was the point of Jesus' final instructions. Go. The world needs to know about me. If the disciples had missed this, then everything Jesus did would have been for naught. Jesus did not care about the disciples just understanding what he taught. He did care about them understanding what he taught. He says it right there in Matthew 28. But the reason why he cared about them understanding what he taught is so that they could teach other people. So they could take what he taught and move it beyond themselves so that the world would be changed forever. So if Jesus calls disciples to send disciples, then the question is, what keeps people from saying yes? Why is it that so many places in the world, so many places, frankly, in our country right now, do not know the real Jesus that is written about, that we find in the Bible? And I think there's a couple reasons. I want to be clear up front that I do not believe for one second that the majority of us who fall into this same kind of trap that I've said that I have fallen into many times myself, I don't think it's bad intentions. I don't think that it is just a desire to say, well, no, I don't want to do that part. I do think partially there's a lack of knowledge and understanding that is fundamentally what discipleship is about. But I also think that there are two major barriers we face as people that often prevent us or often block us from accomplishing the entire point of why Jesus called us to follow him to begin with. And to see those, we're going to look at the story of Peter. Now, for those of you who do not know, Peter is Simon, the guy we read about just a moment ago. Okay, we're going to actually get to a point where we look at Jesus renaming him. That's going to be the first passage that we look at. Peter was Jesus' closest, most passionate follower. He was the guy who did the crazy stuff. He was the guy who walked on water. Peter was the guy who cut off a Roman guard's ear. Peter was impulsive and he was rash. I like to think Peter had ADHD because it just makes me feel better. Like I'm in good company. I don't know if he did or didn't, but we're gonna go with that. Impulsivity. Peter was one of the 3 disciples who Jesus, often he would teach the 12, and then, I shouldn't say often, there were a handful of times he would teach the 12, and then he would pull Peter, James, and John to the side. And he would kind of instruct them even further. Peter was a part of the inner circle. Now, if you ask John, John was the one that Jesus loved the most, but that's a different animal. A little Bible nerd joke there. Simon and Andrew, Simon is Peter. So we're going to pick up that story because that story matters a lot in understanding these 2 issues. And that story we find in Matthew chapter 16, starting in verse 17. The context leading directly into this is Jesus has asked the disciples who he is, who they think he is. And Simon has correctly said, you're the Messiah, you're the Son of God, the one we've been waiting on. And so picking up in verse 17, Jesus replies, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter." And this is the moment that Jesus reframes Simon Peter's entire life. He says, "I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." And then he orders his disciples to not tell anybody that he was the Messiah. When Jesus renames Peter, the word in Greek is the word Petros. The name is Petros, which literally means the rock. I mean, what better name could you get from Jesus? You are going to be the rock, the foundation upon which I build my body, my church. And the gates of hell won't be able to do a thing about it. I mean, Peter's got to be flying on cloud 9 at this moment. Or if you're a Spinal Tap fan, maybe cloud 11, because it goes to 11. Sorry, that was a bad joke. But it's funny if you know Spinal Tap. All right. Impulsivity, that whole thing. Peter, I don't imagine that Jesus could have said anything to Peter, anything that would have been more exciting, more encouraging, that would have pumped him up in his soul any more than what Jesus does in this moment. He gives him a new name. He gives him a purpose that is far beyond Peter's wildest imagination. He literally says to Peter, "You are the foundation upon which everything else is going to happen." I mean, my goodness, what would you do if Jesus said something like that to you? It would be, I live my entire life praying and hoping that one day I'll get to the gates of heaven and hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant." But to hear, "You're the rock upon which I'm going to build the future of my church," I mean, that's a whole different thing. And yet, that wasn't the end of Peter's story. In this moment, Jesus speaks identity into Peter. And that identity is going to play a huge role in what is to come. Because as time continues, Peter follows Jesus closely and he does the kind of crazy, rash stuff, but he's Jesus' closest follower. He's the one who's always willing to do the crazy thing and to trust Jesus at a level that no one else does. And yet, Peter also ends up being the one who falls the hardest. Because there's this one distinct moment in time where Jesus is getting ready to be arrested. Now, he knows what's to come. The disciples don't. Jesus has kind of told them, but they don't really understand it. And at one point, he says what's going to happen, and Peter's like, no, that can't happen. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan, which is a weird thing to say to the rock upon which you're going to build your church, but it is what it is. And then Jesus says to Peter, you know what's going to happen? You're going to deny me. You're going to deny that you even know who I am. And Peter says, never. I would never do that. Which, side note, it's not the best idea to argue with Jesus about what's going to happen. But Peter did it, and he did it pretty regularly. Peter says, I would never do that, Jesus. I would never deny you. And yet, he does exactly that. In Jesus' darkest moment, as he is on trial, as he is being beaten for crimes he did not commit, as he is preparing to carry the cross to Golgotha to be crucified for the sin of the world, Peter denies even knowing who he is 3 times. Jesus warned him, and he still couldn't muster up the strength and the self-control to not do it. I mean, it's a failure of, quite honestly, probably the deepest kind. It's the kind of failure that you and I like to look at and go, man, how did he do? I mean, Jesus warned him. How could he have possibly done that? And it's in this moment that we see Peter having an identity crisis. Because if you know the story, you know that after Peter does this, he leaves Jerusalem. Peter, as far as we know, is not present at the crucifixion of Jesus. He had left. He was gone. He went back to Galilee, and he went back to his nets. He went back to fishing because that's what he knew. Now, I'm going to be as plain as I can be here. I am reading way between the lines, and I am doing some human psychological work that really I'm not qualified to do. But I know people. I know what motivates us. And I know why often when we take drastic action and make big decisions, I can typically identify why that is. And here is what I believe with every fiber of my being. In this moment, what happened to Peter is he went, I'm not cut out to follow Jesus. Clearly. I just failed him in the worst way. I'm not cut out for this. But you know what I am cut out for? I know how to fish. I've done it my whole life. My dad did it. My brother did it. I can catch some fish. So you know what? I'm just going to go back to what I know. I'm going to go back to who I was before. Because clearly who I thought I was is not who I really am. I'm not a Jesus follower. I'm a fisherman. Now again, the Bible does not explicitly say that. I am taking pretty significant creative liberties. But I'll go to my grave believing that is why Peter went back to his boats. Because I've seen this play out time and time and time again in people that I've walked with through hard things. I've seen this play out time and time and time again in my own life. When in moments where I feel like I have let the Lord down, the enemy has started to whisper in my head, see, you aren't cut out to do what he asked you to do. You don't have what it takes. Why don't you just go back to what you know? Why don't you just go back to what you're good at and stop trying to pretend you're a follower of Jesus? I believe Peter had an identity crisis. And I believe that Peter went back to his boats because Peter genuinely in that moment believed he was not fit to be the rock upon which Jesus built his church any longer. And yet, that's not the end of Peter's story. Because there's something extremely powerful that John records. John's gospel is the only gospel that records this interaction. And I am so grateful that he did. Now to be clear, John was one of Jesus' three closest followers, alongside Peter and alongside James. John knew Peter as well as anyone knew Peter. John was one of Peter's best friends. John was there for everything that happened. And here's what John records in the 21st chapter of his gospel. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Pause. This may not feel as pointed right now in this moment as it did to Simon, son of John, in that moment. The context that I did not give you, but that matters, is that this is after Peter's denial of Jesus. Where they were eating was by the side, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, where Peter had been fishing. Jesus had gone and found him to have this exact conversation. Peter had already gone back to the lake. He had already decided he wasn't cut out for the work of Jesus. And so when Jesus finds him, I imagine that Peter's entire internal sense of well-being was shattered, because in that moment he knew that he was confronting the one that he loved but he had denied. And now Jesus looks him in the face and he says, "Do you love me?" And Peter says, "Yes, Lord. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He, being Peter, answered, "Yes, Lord. You know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And here's the moment that convinces me of everything I've said to you about Peter so far. Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time. Peter wasn't some robot who didn't have emotions. Peter was a man, a human like you and like I. And if you had spent your life doing all that you could to serve the Lord, and if Jesus looked you in the face and asked you 3 times in a row, you'd be hurt too, because it would feel like an indictment. Peter's hurt. He's feeling the weight of all that has happened. He's feeling the weight of his betrayal. He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus' response, "Feed my sheep." Why would Jesus have asked Peter 3 times the same question? Why would Jesus have ignored that Peter says, "Lord, you know all things"? Like, he doesn't do anything to reassure him. He doesn't do anything to, I'm a pretty verbose guy. I would have tried to explain some things or tried to smooth things over. He doesn't do any of it. He just repeats, "Feed my sheep, feed my sheep, feed my sheep." Why? The Bible doesn't say. It doesn't tell us. And this is where the Bible does such a masterful job. God did such an incredible thing when he put the scriptures together, because we look at the Bible often as an answer book, and it's usually not actually intended to be an answer book. It's usually intended for us to look at moments like this and chew on them and mull over them and meditate on them and ask those big questions like, why would this have happened? And when you start to do that and you start to piece together Peter's life, I think the answer becomes relatively clear. Peter denied Jesus 3 times. And Jesus asked Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" And for each one of the denials, I believe what Jesus was doing in this moment was he was reminding Peter of who he was. You denied me? Well, let's make sure you understand that you are still the rock who is supposed to feed my sheep. You denied me a second time. So let's fix that piece of your identity now too. You are the rock who will feed my sheep. And the third time, let's cover that one too. I believe that what Jesus was doing in this moment was he was covering over those moments of Peter's. He was reminding Peter that Jesus had already defined him. His mistakes did not. And ultimately, that's what's powerful about this story. Because in this moment, Peter had to answer the question, what lens do I choose to define myself through? Do I choose to define myself through fear and shame? Because if Peter had decided to define himself through fear and shame, he would have gone right back to the boats. He would have become a fisherman again. Why? Because it's what he knew and it's what he had already done. His fear and his shame had already driven him back to the boats. Or Peter could choose to define himself through who Jesus already said he was. And if that were the case, then Peter would have remembered that conversation 3 years before when Jesus said, come follow me and I will make you a fisher of men. Peter would have been dealing in this moment with the two blocks, the same ones that we deal with today. Shame for what he had done and fear that he would fail Jesus again. And frankly, I believe that those are, in my experience, in my own life, in the 2 decades that I have worked with people day in and day out who are doing their best to follow the Lord, it's the same thing I see over and over and over. People who want to follow the Lord, who want to follow Jesus, who want to be disciples, who maybe want to go, but we're afraid and we're full of shame. And if we look at the entire scope of the Bible, it's the same stuff that comes up again and again and again. From the beginning, the enemy has always used shame and fear to drown out the voice of Jesus in our lives. Jesus said, you are Peter, and on you I will build my church. You are the rock. Peter wanted to be a fisherman because his shame and his fear told him that's where he was safest. So what did Peter do? Well, fortunately, we don't have to wonder. In Acts chapter 2, we see Simon Peter, the rock, give the first sermon in the history of the church. He goes and he preaches to the Jews in Jerusalem, and there are thousands saved. Peter becomes the driving force between the name Jesus of Nazareth becoming a global force. It was his obedience, but more than his obedience, it was his willingness to believe what Jesus said, more than what his fear and his shame told him, that drove him to take the name of Jesus to Jerusalem and to begin to change the world. And to be clear, when all of this happened, scholars have no idea. I don't know how old Peter was. He was likely, most scholars believe, in his mid-20s when all this took place. The timeline that we do know is that from the time Peter denied Jesus to the time that Peter preached to Jerusalem was less than 45 days. It was that fast. It was a month and a half that Peter went from fear and shame dominating him and driving his decision-making to remembering who Jesus said he was and changing the entire course of human history. Because that's what happens when we allow who Jesus says we are to define us instead of our guilt and our shame and our fear. We are here today because of men and women like Peter, who chose through the generations not to allow their shame and their fear to define them, but rather to let the voice of God who called them define them, and who chose to go, not because they thought they were capable, not because they thought they were able, but because they knew that Jesus was. And so, if Jesus calls disciples to send disciples, if shame and fear are the blocks to those things, then what do we need to do? We need to decide that our posture will be send me before you know where God will send you. You've got to decide that send me will be your posture before you ever know where God will send you. Now, that might seem like a little bit of a hard right turn because it isn't about guilt, shame, fear, identity, but it is. It's all about it. Because if Peter had chosen to allow his fear and his shame to be what he determined his value through, he never would have preached to Jerusalem. He would have stayed in Galilee. He would have stayed on the boats, and he would not have listened to what Jesus said to him. But instead, Peter chose to go, not because he didn't have shame and fear, but because he believed what Jesus said more than shame and fear. This is what discipleship truly is. It's a decision. It isn't a destination. It's not somewhere we arrive at. It's something we decide. We say, I will follow Jesus wherever he leads, which doesn't mean that we stop at whatever he teaches me. It means that we go to the world that he commissioned his disciples through the generations to go and reach. So this week, if you want to be a follower of Jesus, if you want to truly be a disciple, your obedience is not to figure out where God is sending you. It's just to say yes before he asks. It's to determine in your heart that there is nowhere and nothing that you will say no to. I got to be honest. It's one of the most risky things you can do in your life. And I know that because this is a decision that I had to grapple my way through many, many years ago. And it led me back to my hometown where I never wanted to come back to start a church that has been the hardest journey of my life by leaps and bounds. And if I'm being totally honest, in my flesh, there is a part of me pretty much all the time that wants to say, you know what? There's other things I'm better at. There's other places I'd rather be. I don't want to make all the decisions. I'd rather just be a number two to somebody and just let them have the pressure. I don't want it. And I have had to fight tooth and nail over and over and over and over to fight off the voice of the enemy saying, define yourself through your fear and your shame. You're clearly not cut out for this. You clearly missed something. You clearly misheard the Lord. But I determined in my heart 25 years ago that whatever the Lord asked of me, I would say yes. And it has not been perfect. I have messed it up many times. I have returned to the things that I am more comfortable in many times, and yet the Lord keeps coming back to me and saying, wait, what did you say to me? Return to your commitment. So this week, your obedience is not to figure out where God is sending you. It's to stop saying no before he asks. Because a disciple is not just someone who follows Jesus closely. A disciple of Jesus is someone who is willing to be sent by him completely. So right now, I'm not asking you to go anywhere or telling you need to. I'm just asking you to choose the answer before the question. So in a few moments, we're going to sing together. And as we do, I do not want you to sing the song we're going to sing, which is we picked specifically for this moment. I don't want you to sing it as a prayer of a promise of what you'll do. Rather, I want you to sing it as a prayer of availability. I want you to use the words as a simple way to say to the Lord, I am available to you. Not, I know where you're sending me, but Jesus, my answer is yes. So let me pray for us.